As international mediators and Hamas delegates are in Cairo this week to try and set up a pause in the war. Envoys from the Palestinian militant group and the U.S. are meeting with Qatari and Egyptian mediators this Tuesday. This is the third day of negotiations over a 6-week truce, the exchange of dozens of remaining hostages for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, and the flow of aid to Gaza. Israeli delegates have so far stayed away from the negotiations despite growing diplomatic pressure for a truce before the Muslim holy month of Ramadan early next week. My guest today is Aurélie Godard, an anesthesiologist and medical team leader who was in Gaza for Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders. Thanks so much, Aurélie, for speaking to us. Now, you came back from Gaza in early February after 5 weeks on the ground. First of all, tell us a bit more about MSF's operations there. Where do you have operations now?
So the main operation we have now is based in Rafah in the south, because we've been pushed back along the offensive. We, like MSF, had to evacuate 9 health facilities along the last 5 months. So most of our operations, we've been cornered in the south, exactly as a population, because that's the only location where a minimal safety is guaranteed for our patients and our staff. So mostly based in Rafah in the south. Everything else up north is still extremely difficult to reach and unsafe, unfortunately.
You yourself, though, were one of the rare people who got into northern Gaza while you were there. What was the situation like? What did you see?
So that was already 1 month ago, and I would say that it was already at that time apocalyptic, from people already starving, maybe not to death at that time, but starving to a point that when we passed with the convoy, the only thing we asked was, where is the food, where is the water? The streets and the town in Gaza is vastly destroyed. Like, there are rubbles everywhere. There's not one single street that is free from being destroyed. And the hospital itself, which was trying to resume some activities in Shifa Hospital, it was very, very minimally functioning, I would say, because most of the hospital was more for refugee camp, because people still tend to think that there's a bit of safety guaranteed within the hospital premises. So they sought for some safety inside. So keeping and maintaining medical activity when you have tens of thousands of people around is quite challenging. So the situation was already apocalyptic, and that was 1 month ago. So it can only be worse now, definitely.
Indeed, and northern Gaza is where 6 children died from dehydration, from malnutrition in hospitals just over the weekend. Would you say the situation has been particularly difficult for children?
Definitely, they are more vulnerable as the elderly people. It's population that is suffering first from any injuries, any wounds, or any lack of food and water. So they're more prone to have like digestive disorders and suffer from hunger, and they are growing. So they have nutritional needs that are quite specific to their age. And definitely the famine that is going on in the north is not able to provide this more vulnerable patients to what they need, both in terms of nutrition and as well in terms of care.
Aurélie, the MSF patients, obviously not just children, also men and women. But what happens to these people after they leave the hospital? Where do they go?
So that's a very good question. Usually people are quite happy when you tell them, well, you're going to be discharged, the wound has healed, everything's going better. It's rather the opposite in Rafah Hospital, because they have nowhere where to go. So most of the times when you tell them, well, it's finished, now we're going to follow you up, but just as ambulatory patient, they're quite afraid, because most of the time they're going to ask for 1-2 days to organize themselves to buy or to build a tent, a shelter. But they're being thrown back into the extremely difficult life they have outside the hospital, and where access to water, food, etc. is extremely challenging. So unlike the usual situations, being discharged from the hospital is not necessarily so good news, because you're thrown back into hell, basically. So we were able to make them understand that, well, we need the bed for patients coming in, but that was already heartbreaking. Every time you discharge a patient, it's heartbreaking because you don't know if actually you can make it just for the daily life situations. So very difficult situation.
And Aurélie, I imagine heartbreaking for you spending those 5 weeks there in Gaza. How did it feel when you left after those 5 weeks on the ground?
So you feel abandoning them, patients and our staff. You know that they remain there under the bombardments, not knowing if they're going to survive until tomorrow or next week. You get quite prepared when you go in, saying, well, I'm going into a situation that I'm not so sure about, but getting out was quite surprisingly very difficult as well, because you abandon them and there's nothing else you can do except testifying, which I'm doing with you right now. But that's the only thing I can do for them from outside. But yeah, they have nowhere to go. They are terrified. They don't know what's going to happen. And you go back to your normal life, no matter what.
Well, Aurélie, thank you so much for sharing that with us and for sharing your experience and keeping their stories alive of all those people there who are suffering in Gaza. Aurélie Godard speaking to me there from Doctors Without Borders. Thank you.